The bananas were the most jarring sight. Piled high in abundant yellow mountains, they sat casually in West Berlin's grocery stores, as if their presence was nothing extraordinary. For visitors from East Germany crossing through Checkpoint Charlie on rare approved visits, these simple curved fruits represented something almost incomprehensible, the physical manifestation of two diverging economic realities. It wasn't just that bananas existed in the West, it was that they existed in such profusion, such mundane abundance, that no one seemed to notice them at all. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. It was Christmas 1975, and Petra Müller had received permission for a one-day visit to relatives in West Berlin, a rarity granted mostly to retirees or on special occasions. She had been planning carefully for weeks what gifts to bring, what she might be allowed to bring back, what she would wear to not look too Eastern. But nothing had prepared her for the sensory overload that awaited. Later, she would write in her diary, "The shops on Kurfürstendamm didn't just have food, they had every kind of food at any time of year. Oranges in December, coffee without queuing. I stood in front of a display of chocolate bars and began to cry right there in the store. A saleswoman asked if I needed help, but how could I explain that I was crying over chocolate?" This intimate moment of cultural shock captures the essence of a divided Germany that went far beyond political ideology or the physical barrier of the Berlin Wall. By the 1970s, the German Democratic Republic, GDR or East Germany, and the Federal Republic of Germany, FRG or West Germany, had evolved into parallel universes with dramatically different everyday realities, perhaps most visibly expressed through consumer culture and food availability. The Cold War's fault line ran directly through Berlin, transforming a once unified city into the most visible physical manifestation of the Iron Curtain. After the Berlin Wall's construction in August 1961, the division became nearly impermeable. Most East Germans would never set foot in the West, making those who did receive permission for short visits the bearers of almost mythical tales upon their return. Their stories of abundance, particularly of tropical fruits, quality coffee, and seemingly endless consumer goods, were often met with disbelief or accusations of Western propaganda. This division had not happened overnight. The seeds were planted in the immediate aftermath of World War II, when Germany was divided into occupation zones. The Soviet zone, which would become East Germany, faced the harshest initial conditions. Soviet reparation policies stripped factories of equipment, and agricultural land underwent forced collectivization. Meanwhile, the Western zones benefited from Marshall Plan aid and retained their industrial infrastructure. By the time the two German states were formally established in 1949, they were already on divergent economic paths. East Germany developed under the Soviet model of centralized economic planning. 5-year plans dictated production quotas, pricing structures, and resource allocation. The system prioritized heavy industry, military production, and basic necessities over consumer goods. In theory, this would create a more equitable society where essential needs were met for all citizens. In practice, it created chronic shortages of everyday items that Westerners took for granted. Dr. Hans Weber, who worked as an economic planner in East Berlin from 1964 to 1982, explained in a 2005 interview, "We were not trying to create scarcity. The opposite. We were attempting to achieve abundance through rational planning, but we constantly faced hard currency shortages for imports, production inefficiencies, and pressure to export our best products to earn foreign currency. The result was that many goods East Germans desired simply weren't available or were strictly rationed." Coffee illustrates this dilemma perfectly. By the 1970s, coffee had become the GDR's second-largest import item by value, consuming precious hard currency. East Germans were among the world's highest per capita coffee consumers, seeing it as an essential part of social life rather than a luxury. The government repeatedly attempted to reduce consumption through price increases and even developing coffee substitutes blended with chicory, mockingly nicknamed Eric's Krönung, after party chairman Erich Honecker, a play on the popular West German brand Jacobs Krönung. When a poor Brazilian harvest in 1976-77 sent world coffee prices soaring, the GDR faced a crisis. Cutting coffee imports would save hard currency, but risked public outrage. The government chose to maintain coffee supplies by shifting funds from other sectors, demonstrating how even seemingly minor consumer goods could take on political significance. Bananas represented an even more complicated challenge. As a tropical fruit that couldn't be grown domestically, they required hard currency imports, typically from Cuba or other socialist allied nations. Distribution was erratic, leading to the famous phenomenon where news of a banana shipment arriving at a store would spread like wildfire, creating instant queues around the block. Jut Liebknecht, who grew up in Leipzig during the 1970s, recalled, "When bananas appeared, my mother would drop everything and rush to the store. Sometimes she would stand in line for 2 hours. Each person was limited to 2 kilograms. The bananas were often greenish or already brown in spots, but we didn't care. My parents would make a celebration of it, slicing them carefully to make them last several days. In our family photos from birthdays, you can sometimes spot a banana on the cake as the special decoration." This scarcity transformed ordinary fruits into luxury items. Children received oranges as special Christmas treats. Bananas became symbolic birthday gifts. Coffee was hoarded and used as an unofficial currency for bribes or favors. The psychological impact was profound, creating a society where consumer goods took on outsized importance precisely because they were so difficult to obtain. Meanwhile, just kilometers away in West Berlin, these same items sat in mundane abundance on supermarket shelves. West Germany had embraced the market economy and consumer culture with enthusiasm. The economic miracle, Wirtschaftswunder, of the 1950s and 60s had transformed West Germany from post-war devastation to one of the world's richest economies. Chancellor Ludwig Erhard's vision of a social market economy combined free market principles with robust welfare systems, creating widespread prosperity. For West Berliners, living on an island of capitalism surrounded by communist territory, consumption took on additional symbolic weight. The gleaming shop windows of Kurfürstendamm weren't just stores. They were ideological statements, visible demonstrations of Western abundance deliberately positioned where East Berliners could glimpse them from across the wall. West Berlin received special economic subsidies from the federal government precisely to maintain this showcase function. Klaus Schütz, who served as governing mayor of West Berlin from 1967 to 1977, was explicit about this role. "Berlin is more than a city, it is a political demonstration. Every new department store, every new factory, every flourishing garden is a challenge to those who would have us believe that freedom must be sacrificed for economic security." The contrast between the two systems was deliberately amplified through West German television broadcasts, which could be received in most parts of East Germany despite official prohibitions. Commercials showing fully stocked supermarkets and lavish meals became a form of unintentional psychological warfare, creating constant reminders of what existed just beyond the wall. East German authorities coined the term Westfernsehen, Western television, as a perceived threat to socialist values, but were unable to prevent its influence. Horst Sindermann, a member of the East German Politburo, famously complained, "Every evening at 8 p.m., 7 million East Germans emigrate to the West for a couple of hours before coming back at 10 p.m. The joke contained a serious truth. East Germans lived in a split reality, physically present in socialism, while mentally comparing their conditions to capitalist abundance. For those East Germans granted rare permission to visit the West, this split reality became viscerally personal. The standard narrative portrays these visitors as uniformly awestruck by Western abundance, but the reality was more complex. Many experienced conflicting emotions: desire for the goods on display, pride in East German social achievements, discomfort with commercial culture, guilt about enjoying privileges denied to friends and relatives, and confusion about their own identity in this alien environment. Dieter Hoffmann, who visited his aunt in Hamburg in 1978, described this ambivalence: "Yes, I was impressed by the stores. Who wouldn't be? But I also felt something was wrong with a society so focused on buying things." My aunt took me shopping, insisting on buying me clothes, and seemed disappointed when I wasn't more excited. I felt embarrassed by her pity. We had a good life in Leipzig, different, but not just deprivation as Westerners seem to think. I was prouder of our Olympic athletes and our free childcare than I was impressed by their fancy coffee machines. The East German government attempted to counter these impressions by emphasizing socialist achievements: full employment, affordable housing, comprehensive child care, and social equality. State propaganda highlighted homelessness and unemployment in the West, portraying capitalism as creating superficial consumer abundance for some while leaving others behind. There was truth in this critique, though it conveniently ignored East Germany's own profound economic problems. By the mid-1970s, East German leaders recognized that consumer satisfaction had become politically essential. Under Erich Honecker, who succeeded Walter Ulbricht in 1971, the GDR implemented a unity of economic and social policy that shifted resources toward consumer goods and housing. This represented a tacit admission that the regime's legitimacy now depended on material prosperity as much as socialist ideology. The problem was that East Germany couldn't afford this prosperity. The increased focus on consumer goods came precisely as the economy was struggling with rising energy costs, outdated industrial infrastructure, and mounting foreign debt. Honecker's consumer initiatives, while temporarily popular, ultimately accelerated the GDR's economic decline by diverting resources from necessary industrial investments. Documents from the East German State Planning Commission, declassified after reunification, reveal the depth of this dilemma. A 1978 confidential analysis warned, "Maintaining current levels of coffee, citrus fruit, and chocolate imports will require additional hard currency loans of approximately 560 million Valuta-Mark annually. This is unsustainable given our current export capacity and existing debt service obligations." The report recommended gradually reducing imports of consumer goods while expanding domestic substitutes, but political leaders rejected these proposals as too risky for public morale. Instead, the GDR borrowed heavily from Western banks throughout the 1970s, using the loans to finance both industrial modernization and consumer imports. The debt burden became increasingly unsustainable, rising from virtually nothing in 1970 to approximately 12 billion Valuta-Mark by 1980. When Polish workers formed the Independent Solidarity Trade Union in 1980, prompting fears of similar unrest spreading to East Germany, the regime responded by further increasing consumer goods imports despite the economic consequences. For ordinary East Germans, the result was a peculiar economic landscape where basic necessities remained affordable, but desirable consumer goods existed in a perpetual state of scarcity. This created the famous queuing culture that became emblematic of daily life. People didn't just queue when they needed something, they queued whenever desirable goods appeared, whether they immediately needed them or not. Manfred Krug, a popular East German actor who later emigrated to the West, captured this reality in his description of shopping. In the GDR, when you saw a queue, you joined it first and only afterward asked what they were selling. It might be something you needed or something you could trade with your neighbor for something else. Acquiring goods wasn't shopping in the Western sense. It was more like hunting, requiring patience, connections, and a network of favors. This system created its own peculiar form of social capital. Having Beziehungen, connections, became essential. Knowing the butcher who would save a good cut of meat, having a relative who worked in a coffee importing company, befriending the delivery man who could tell you when bananas would arrive. Those with connections to the West, like Petra Miller with her Christmas visit, gained particular status and responsibility. When I returned from West Berlin, Petra recalled, relatives I barely knew appeared at our apartment. They didn't directly ask for gifts, that would be impolite, but they mentioned their children's birthdays or admired my Western clothes in a way that made expectations clear. I had brought chocolate bars and instant coffee packets, carefully distributing them to family first, but I couldn't help everyone, and this created tension. Some neighbors stopped speaking to us after learning we had received a Western visit but hadn't shared any gifts with them. The psychological impact of this scarcity amid plenty dynamic, scarcity at home, plenty visible across the border, created complex effects on East German society. For some, it reinforced dissatisfaction with the socialist system and fueled desires to emigrate. For others, it created a defiant pride in making do with less and building a society on values beyond consumption. Most people simply developed pragmatic coping strategies, neither fully embracing nor rejecting the system, but navigating its constraints as best they could. By the late 1970s, this balancing act was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. East Germany's economy struggled under mounting debt and inefficient production, while citizens' expectations continued to rise, partially influenced by glimpses of Western abundance. The government's attempts to address these contradictions only highlighted their fundamental nature. In December 1977, the Politburo launched a new initiative to address persistent consumer complaints. State-owned camera manufacturer Pentagon would produce a domestic instant camera, the EE-100, to compete with popular Western models like Polaroid. The camera was rushed into production despite technical problems and priced at 160 East German marks, approximately a week's average salary. When the cameras appeared in shops in April 1978, they sold out immediately despite the high price and well-known quality issues. Werner Schmidt, who worked as a sales clerk at the Centrum department store in East Berlin, described the scene. We received a shipment of 50 EE-100 cameras. The store opened at 9 na, and by 9:20 we had sold every camera. People who had been waiting since early morning but weren't close enough to the front of the line became angry, shouting that the cameras had been reserved for people with connections. A woman cried because she had promised her son a camera for his birthday. Another customer demanded to see the manager, insisting we must have hidden stock in the back. It was chaos over a camera that everyone knew wasn't very good. This incident illustrated the fundamental contradiction in East German consumer culture. Even when the state succeeded in producing desirable goods, it couldn't produce enough to satisfy demand. The very success of initiatives to improve consumer satisfaction often backfired by highlighting the system's limitations. The same dynamic played out with Western imports. When limited quantities of Levi's jeans became available in intershop stores, which sold Western goods for hard currency, they created a sensation. Young East Germans would save for months to afford a single pair, which cost approximately a month's average salary when exchanged into Western currency. The jeans became powerful status symbols, instantly identifying the wearer as someone with either Western connections or significant disposable income. Intershop stores themselves represented the regime's contradictory approach to Western consumer goods. Originally established in the 1960s to capture hard currency from Western tourists, they were increasingly used by East Germans with access to Western money. By allowing citizens to purchase otherwise unavailable Western products, if they could obtain the necessary currency, the government tacitly acknowledged both the desirability of these goods and its own inability to produce comparable alternatives. This created an awkward two-tier consumer society. Those with Western currency access through relatives abroad, work in the tourism industry, or involvement in the arts could purchase coveted items unavailable to ordinary citizens. The system that prided itself on equality had effectively sanctioned fundamental consumer inequality. Günter Mittag, the Politburo member responsible for economic affairs, defended this contradiction in a closed-party meeting in 1979. The Intershop network serves our economic interests by capturing hard currency that strengthens our import capacity for essential industrial inputs. Concerns about ideological impacts are secondary to this economic necessity. This stark admission revealed how far economic pragmatism had superseded ideological purity. By 1980, as economic conditions deteriorated further, the East German government increasingly relied on two contradictory strategies: expanding surveillance and repression to prevent organized dissent, while simultaneously making small consumer concessions to maintain public acquiescence. Both approaches represented desperate attempts to manage an increasingly unsustainable situation. When solidarity emerged in neighboring Poland, East German authorities watched with alarm. In a secret Stasi report from September 1980, Security Chief Erich Mielke warned, "Events in Poland demonstrate the potential consequences of consumer dissatisfaction combined with ideological liberalization. We must intensify both our surveillance of potential opposition groups and our efforts to satisfy basic consumer needs, particularly in the food sector." The government responded by temporarily increasing imports of coffee, chocolate, and tropical fruits despite the economic cost. Bananas appeared more frequently in stores, though still not with Western regularity. Special efforts were made to stock East Berlin shops when international events brought Western visitors who might compare conditions with West Berlin. These efforts created momentary improvements, but couldn't address the underlying structural problems. East Germany remained caught in an impossible position, unable to match Western consumer abundance without abandoning central economic planning, yet increasingly judged by its citizens according to Western material standards. For East Germans like Petra Müller, who had glimpsed the other side, the contradictions became increasingly difficult to reconcile. After my visit to West Berlin, she recalled, ordinary life seemed more frustrating. Waiting an hour for low-quality coffee suddenly felt absurd when I had seen shelves full of different brands. But I also felt guilty for these thoughts, as if I was betraying my country by wanting something as trivial as good coffee. My husband told me to stop talking about my visit because it only made everyday life harder to accept. This tension between glimpsed possibilities and daily realities would ultimately prove unsustainable. By the mid-1980s, even the East German leadership recognized that consumer satisfaction through increased imports was economically impossible to maintain. Internal documents from 1985 reveal contingency plans for reducing tropical fruit imports by 30% and coffee imports by 15%, despite the anticipated public reaction. What they couldn't have anticipated was how dramatically the situation would unravel just a few years later. The seemingly mundane desire for bananas, coffee, and consumer choice would become intertwined with larger demands for political freedom, environmental protection, and human rights. When the Berlin Wall finally fell in November 1989, the rush of East Germans to West Berlin wasn't just about political liberation. It was also about the immediate, tangible freedom to purchase a banana without queuing, to choose between coffee brands, to experience consumer abundance not as a rare glimpse, but as a daily reality. As thousands streamed through the newly opened borders on that November night, many headed directly to West Berlin supermarkets. Contemporary news footage shows East Germans filling shopping carts with bananas, coffee, chocolate, and other long-desired goods. Some wept openly in the aisles, overwhelmed by the simple abundance that West Germans took for granted. The moment captured both the profound human desire for freedom and the complex ways that desire had become intertwined with consumer culture during 40 years of division. What happened next would challenge both East and West Germans to reevaluate their assumptions about consumption, value, and identity. The banana, that simple curved fruit that had taken on such outsized symbolic importance, would be at the center of this reckoning. But the story of what followed, of reunification, economic shock, cultural disorientation, and ultimately adaptation, reveals complexities that went far beyond simple narratives of capitalist triumph or socialist failure. The fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989, unleashed a consumer frenzy that few had anticipated. Within hours of the border opening, East Germans formed long lines not at museums or historical sites, but at West Berlin banks to collect their welcome money, Begrüßungsgeld, 100 Deutsche Marks given to each visitor from the East. This money immediately flowed into West Berlin shops, creating surreal scenes as East Germans filled shopping carts with items they had only seen in Western television commercials or heard about from relatives. Dieter Hoffmann, who had felt such ambivalence during his 1978 visit to Hamburg, found himself among the crowds that November weekend. I told myself I was just going to see the wall opening, to witness history. But by morning I was standing in Kaufhaus des Westens with a shopping basket full of bananas, coffee, and chocolate. I felt simultaneously elated and ashamed, elated to finally have these things without restriction, ashamed to realize how important they had become to me. Was this what freedom meant? The right to buy fruit? The banana quickly emerged as the unexpected symbol of this first wave of East-West encounters. West Berlin shops sold an estimated 2.5 million bananas during the first weekend after the wall opened, more than twice the normal volume. Some stores reported selling out their entire monthly banana supply in a single day. Images of East Germans cradling bunches of bananas appeared on news broadcasts worldwide, becoming an instantly recognizable visual shorthand for the fall of communism. This banana rush was more than just fulfilling a craving for tropical fruit. It represented immediate, tangible access to something that had been systematically denied, not through official prohibition, but through economic scarcity and political division. Unlike freedom of speech or travel, which remained abstract concepts until exercised, the banana offered instant gratification and visible proof that the system had truly changed. West German shopkeepers responded to the demand with a mixture of welcome, opportunism, and occasional bewilderment. Supermarket chains arranged emergency banana shipments, with some stores posting signs in their windows, "Bananen für unsere Zonenbrüder," bananas for our zone brothers, using the somewhat patronizing term zone that West Germans often applied to East Germany. While meant as a friendly gesture, such signs highlighted the unequal power dynamic of the interaction. Helga Weber, who managed a supermarket near Checkpoint Charlie, recalled, "We had East Germans coming in just for bananas, buying 5 or 6 kilos at once. Some were tearful, explaining they wanted their children to experience having as many bananas as they wanted. Others seemed almost angry, grabbing fruit as if they feared it might disappear. One elderly man stood staring at our coffee aisle for nearly an hour, overwhelmed by seeing 15 different brands when he was used to having just 1 or 2 options. This initial consumption euphoria quickly gave way to more complex reactions. Many East Germans experienced a form of sensory and choice overload that psychologists later termed West shock. West shock. After decades of limited options, the sheer variety of products proved disorienting. Simple shopping decisions became overwhelming when faced with 20 types of yogurt or 30 breakfast cereals. Some found the experience liberating, others found it anxiety-inducing. Petra Mueller, whose Christmas 1975 visit had left such a lasting impression, described her first post-wall shopping trip. In the East, shopping required planning, patience, and persistence. In the West, it required decision-making skills I hadn't developed. I stood paralyzed in front of shelves, unable to choose between products that all seemed basically the same but with different packaging. A West Berlin woman behind me in line grew impatient, muttering that Ossis were slowing everything down. I felt humiliated, like a provincial visitor who didn't know the proper customs. These everyday interactions revealed how consumer competence had become a marker of cultural belonging. East Germans found themselves treated as awkward country cousins who didn't understand the rules of modern shopping. West Germans, meanwhile, often displayed a mixture of superiority and pity that many Easterners found condescending. The supposedly neutral space of the supermarket became an arena where 4 decades of separation manifested in subtle cultural frictions. Beyond these immediate encounters, the newly opened borders forced both German states to confront more fundamental questions about their future relationship. While politicians debated various scenarios, confederation, gradual integration, maintaining 2 states with open borders, economic realities, quickly outpaced political deliberations. The East German economy, exposed to direct comparison with Western abundance, began to unravel with stunning speed. By December 1989, East German retail sales had plummeted by nearly 50%. Citizens were either saving their money for Western goods or crossing the border to shop. East German products remained on shelves, unsold and increasingly unwanted. Factories reported growing absenteeism as workers used their new travel freedom to explore the West or search for higher-paying jobs. The currency exchange rate on the black market reached 20 East German marks to 1 Deutsche Mark, reflecting collapsing confidence in the Eastern economy. The East German transitional government, led by Hans Modrow, found itself in an impossible position. Maintaining the separate East German economy seemed increasingly unviable, but rapid integration with the West threatened massive unemployment and social dislocation. Meanwhile, the population grew increasingly impatient with half measures, demanding immediate access to Western living standards. This impatience manifested in the March 1990 East German elections, where parties advocating rapid reunification won a decisive victory. The slogan, "Kommt die D-Mark, bleiben wir. Kommt sie nicht, gehen wir zu ihr." If the Deutsche Mark comes to us, we'll stay. If it doesn't, we'll go to it, captured the popular mood. Economic considerations, specifically access to Western consumer abundance symbolized by the Deutsche Mark, had overtaken more nuanced discussions about preserving potentially valuable aspects of East German society. The currency union implemented on July 1, 1990, exchanged East German marks for Deutsche Marks at a politically determined 1.1 rate for wages, pensions, and basic savings, with higher amounts converted at less favorable rates. This rate, while psychologically important for East Germans, bore little relationship to the actual productivity gap between the economies. Chancellor Helmut Kohl's government chose political expediency over economic concerns, overruling Bundesbank warnings about the consequences. Those consequences arrived with shocking speed. Eastern products, suddenly priced in Deutsche Marks without comparable quality, couldn't compete with Western imports. Within months, industrial production in the former GDR collapsed by nearly 50%. Unemployment, essentially non-existent under communism, soared to over 15% by early 1991. The promised consumer paradise came with an unexpected price: economic devastation and profound social dislocation. Former East German economist Hans Weber observed the process with growing alarm. "We expected difficulties during transition, but not this wholesale dismissal of everything Eastern." Suddenly, 40 years of economic development was declared worthless. Factories that could have been modernized were simply closed. Products that might have found niches with investment were discontinued. The message was clear: the West had won, the East had failed, and nothing from the Eastern economy was worth preserving. This wholesale rejection extended beyond industrial products to consumer goods that had formed part of everyday Eastern life. Brands like Florina Skincare, Spreewelder Pickles, and Club Cola, products that many East Germans had used and enjoyed despite their limitations, suddenly disappeared from shelves, replaced by Western alternatives that weren't necessarily superior but carried the prestige of Western marketing. The banana itself became entangled in this transition. German reunification coincided with a European Union decision to impose import quotas on Latin American bananas to protect producers in former European colonies. The resulting banana war trade dispute with the United States sent prices rising precisely as East Germans were finally gaining regular access. Some Western media outlets mockingly referred to former East Germans as Bananen Ossis, Banana Easterners, reducing their complex political transformation to a simplistic craving for tropical fruit. These experiences created a profound psychological disjunction for many former East Germans. The consumer abundance they had long desired arrived simultaneously with economic insecurity many had never experienced. Factory closures, job losses, and housing uncertainties replaced the previous system's limitations with new forms of anxiety. The freedom to buy bananas meant little without the money to afford them. This disillusionment fueled a complex phenomenon that emerged in the mid-1990s. Ostalgie, or nostalgia, for aspects of East German life. What began as informal social gatherings where former GDR citizens shared memories eventually developed into a cultural movement. Television shows, theme parties, and specialty shops celebrated or recreated aspects of Eastern consumer culture that had been abruptly eliminated. Psychologists identified this not as actual desire to return to communism, but as a response to the perceived devaluation of Eastern identities during reunification. When everything familiar was suddenly labeled inferior and replaced, preserving some connection to these products became an act of cultural resistance. Even the much-maligned East German coffee brands like Rostfein found new markets among those seeking connections to their past. Monika Hennig opened Ostpaket in Berlin in 1993, one of the first shops specializing in GDR products. Initially, people came looking for practical items they could no longer find, particular cleaning products or food brands they preferred. But gradually, it became more about emotional connection. Customers would see a package design and share stories about what that product meant in their lives. It wasn't that these were superior products. Everyone knew Western coffee tasted better, but they were part of shared experience that was being erased. The irony was not lost on participants. Having finally gained access to Western abundance, some East Germans found themselves deliberately seeking out the limited Eastern products they had once been desperate to replace. But this wasn't simple contradiction. It reflected the complex reality that consumer goods carry cultural and emotional significance beyond their utilitarian function. For West Germans, this Ostalgie often seemed incomprehensible or politically suspect. Having long pitied Easterners for their material deprivation, they struggled to understand how anyone could feel nostalgia for products that seemed objectively inferior. This incomprehension further reinforced the cultural divide, creating the impression that former East Germans were somehow irrational or ungrateful for Western rescue. By the late 1990s, a more nuanced understanding began to emerge. Sociological studies revealed that East Germans weren't rejecting Western prosperity, but rather the implied narrative that their entire previous lives represented nothing but scarcity and deprivation. The banana and coffee shortages had been real and frustrating, but Eastern lives had consisted of more than just waiting in queues. By selectively reclaiming and revaluing aspects of GDR consumer culture, former East Germans asserted the legitimacy of their distinct historical experience. Wolfgang Thiers, an East German intellectual who became president of the Unified German Parliament, articulated this perspective. The error of Western politicians and economists was believing that East Germans simply wanted to become West Germans, that 40 years of separate development had created no distinct identity worth preserving. But people don't want to be told that everything they knew, everything they created under difficult circumstances, was worthless. Integration should have meant combining the best of both systems rather than simply extending the Western system eastward. Even banana consumption reflected this complexity. A 1998 market research study found that while East German banana consumption had initially surged after reunification, it eventually stabilized at levels only slightly higher than in Western Germany. The mythologized East German banana craving, it seemed, had been more about forbidden access than about the fruit itself. Once bananas became ordinary, they lost their symbolic power. Coffee, meanwhile, revealed a different pattern. East Germans maintained higher per capita coffee consumption than their Western counterparts even after reunification, continuing a cultural pattern established during the GDR years when coffee represented an essential social ritual despite its scarcity. However, Eastern preferences shifted decisively toward Western brands, with former GDR coffee varieties largely disappearing except as novelty items in nostalgia shops. Former Stasi documents declassified in the late 1990s revealed how seriously the East German government had taken these consumer issues. A 1989 analysis prepared just months before the wall fell warned, internal surveys indicate that public dissatisfaction regarding consumer supply has reached critical levels. Citizens increasingly compare their situation not with previous GDR conditions, but with perceived Western standards. This represents a fundamental legitimation crisis that cannot be addressed through minor policy adjustments. The document recommended a dramatic reallocation of resources toward consumer goods, even at the expense of industrial investment, but acknowledged such measures can only temporarily mitigate dissatisfaction. The fundamental contradiction between our economic system and public expectations of Western-style consumer abundance cannot be resolved without structural reforms that would undermine socialist economic principles. This frank assessment arrived too late to save the GDR, but it accurately diagnosed the fundamental contradiction that would accelerate its collapse. A system built on principles of collective welfare and equitable distribution had increasingly come to be judged by its citizens according to individualistic consumer standards, standards deliberately encouraged by Western media penetration and cross-border family connections. By the early 2000s, as reunified Germany worked through the complex legacies of division, the banana had ceased to function as a political symbol. Younger Germans who had no memory of separation increasingly viewed the banana story as a quaint historical anecdote rather than lived experience. The generation born after reunification could barely comprehend a world where such a common fruit would be rare enough to cause excitement. Yet for those who had experienced the divided years, certain consumer experiences still triggered powerful memories. Petra Müller, whose Christmas visit to West Berlin had left such a lasting impression, reflected in a 2005 interview, "My grandchildren don't understand why I still get a special pleasure from buying good coffee or why I sometimes buy more bananas than we need. They've grown up with abundance as the normal condition. But for my generation, these simple things will always carry the weight of history, not just political history, but personal history, family history." This generational divide extended to broader evaluations of the reunification process. Those who had been adults during the GDR period often maintained more critical perspectives on how economic integration had been handled, particularly the rapid dismantling of Eastern industries and social institutions. Those who had been children during transition or born afterward typically embraced Western consumer culture without reservation, while viewing the East German period as distant history. Reunification's economic impact proved more lasting than many had anticipated. 30 years after the wall fell, significant economic disparities persisted between Eastern and Western regions. While the most visible consumer differences disappeared, shops throughout Germany now offered identical products. Structural inequalities remained in areas like property ownership, average wages, and pension levels. These ongoing disparities fueled periodic resurges of East German regional identity, particularly during economic downturns. Political movements emerged that combined criticism of capitalism's excesses with assertions of distinct Eastern values and experiences. The rise of parties like Die Linke, the left, and later Alternative for Deutschland, AfD, while representing opposite ends of the political spectrum, both found significant support in former East German regions, partly by appealing to feelings of Western neglect and cultural dismissal. Social psychologist Dr. Jutta Schroeder, who studied East-West integration patterns over 3 decades, identified a persistent recognition deficit in how reunification was framed. The dominant narrative presented reunification as the West rescuing the East, with East Germans expected to feel nothing but gratitude. This framing denied agency to East Germans and dismissed 40 years of their lives as merely waiting for freedom. Even successful integration required accepting this narrative, which created lasting resentment among those who felt their experience was devalued. This recognition deficit extended to how consumer experiences were interpreted. The banana story, originally used to illustrate genuine material deprivation under communism, gradually transformed in Western discourse into a patronizing symbol of Eastern naivety and simplistic materialism. The complexity of how consumer goods functioned within the East German social system, not merely as absent luxuries, but as elements in an elaborate network of informal exchange, social capital, and coping strategies, was frequently overlooked. Historian Dr. Anna Kaminski, director of the Federal Foundation for the Study of the Communist Dictatorship in East Germany, emphasized this complexity. We must understand that scarcity in the GDR wasn't simply about absence. It created an entire parallel social system of connections, favors, patience, and knowledge about how to navigate shortages. When this system suddenly became unnecessary after reunification, people lost not just consumer limitations, but also certain social skills and relationships that had given them status and identity within the Eastern system. This perspective helps explain why some East Germans experienced reunification not just as material gain, but also as a form of loss of social competence in a familiar system, replaced by newcomer status in an unfamiliar one. Their expertise in navigating scarcity became instantly obsolete, while they lacked the consumer literacy that West Germans had developed over decades. Werner Schmidt, the former department store clerk, described this transition. In the East, I knew exactly how the system worked, which deliveries came on which days, who needed to be offered special items under the counter, how to manage customer expectations during shortages. After reunification, I got a job at a Western supermarket chain, but was constantly reprimanded for not understanding marketing strategies or customer service the Western way. All my previous expertise meant nothing. I went from being a skilled professional to being treated like someone who knew nothing. For West Germans who had grown up with consumer abundance, it was often difficult to comprehend how profoundly these material differences had shaped divergent mentalities. Having never experienced systematic scarcity, many Westerners interpreted Eastern behavior patterns, like the tendency to buy in bulk when items were available, or to repair rather than replace damaged goods, as irrational hoarding or excessive frugality, rather than rational adaptations to a different economic reality. Klaus Weber, who worked as an integration consultant for businesses expanding into former East Germany during the 1990s, observed these misunderstandings. Western companies would send marketing teams with strategies that had worked perfectly in Bavaria or North Rhine-Westphalia, then be baffled when they failed in Saxony or Brandenburg. They didn't grasp that decades of different consumer experience had created fundamentally different relationships to advertising, brands, and shopping behaviors. East Germans were simultaneously more skeptical of marketing claims and more loyal to brands that earned their trust. This divergence manifested in consumption patterns that persisted long after reunification. Market research consistently showed that Eastern consumers remained more price-sensitive, more likely to plan purchases carefully, less responsive to lifestyle advertising, and more focused on product durability than their Western counterparts. These weren't simply economic behaviors that would disappear with rising Eastern prosperity, but ingrained cultural differences shaped by decades of distinct experiences. By the 2010s, as reunified Germany prepared to mark 30 years since the Wall's fall, a more nuanced understanding of these differences had gradually emerged. Rather than viewing Eastern consumer behavior as deficiency to be corrected through education in Western consumption, scholars and marketers increasingly recognized the potential value in certain Eastern approaches, particularly as global concerns about sustainability challenged the wisdom of unlimited consumption. Historian Dr. Martin Sabro noted this shift. Initially, Western abundance was presented as unquestionably superior to Eastern scarcity, but as environmental awareness grew, aspects of East German consumption, repairing items instead of replacing them, reducing packaging waste, emphasizing durability over fashion, began to seem less like deprivation and more like sustainability avant la lettre. Not because the GDR was environmentally progressive, which it certainly wasn't, but because scarcity necessitated practices that inadvertently reduced resource use. This perspective offered a way to revalue aspects of Eastern experience without romanticizing the genuine hardships of the communist period. It acknowledged that while nobody wanted to return to queuing for bananas or drinking chicory coffee substitute, certain adaptations to scarcity might contain lessons for a world increasingly concerned about overconsumption and environmental limits. Former East Germans who had lived through both systems found themselves uniquely positioned to evaluate the trade-offs involved. Dieter Hoffmann reflected on this dual perspective. Yes, I enjoy being able to buy bananas whenever I want, but I also recognize what was lost in the transition to consumer abundance. In the East, we spent more time with friends and family, found creative solutions to material problems, and didn't judge each other by possessions. There was a certain solidarity in shared scarcity. Now we have everything available, but less time to enjoy it together. Perfect bananas, but fewer occasions to share them. The food items that had taken on such symbolic importance during division, bananas, coffee, oranges, chocolate, gradually returned to their status as ordinary commodities rather than political symbols. Yet they retained a certain resonance for those who had experienced their scarcity, becoming vessels for intergenerational memory and historical understanding. Petra Müller described sharing this history with her grandchildren. When my granddaughter complained about having nothing to eat despite a full refrigerator, I took her to the kitchen table and put out a banana. I told her about standing in line for 2 hours in the snow, not knowing if bananas would still be available when I reached the front. How receiving an orange for Christmas was a special treat. She was fascinated, not because she wanted to experience scarcity, but because it helped her understand her family's history and appreciate what she has. These intergenerational conversations became increasingly important as direct memory of the divided years receded. The famous banana stories risked simplification into caricature without the context of how consumer goods functioned within the complex social and economic systems of East Germany. Ensuring that younger generations understood this complexity became part of broader efforts to develop a nuanced historical consciousness about division and reunification. Educational initiatives emerged to address this need. The DDR Museum in Berlin created exhibits that allowed visitors to experience aspects of everyday life in East Germany, including its distinctive consumer culture. Rather than focusing exclusively on political repression, these exhibits situated consumption within broader social contexts, explaining not just what products were unavailable, but how people adapted to these limitations through informal networks, creative substitutions, and alternative forms of status and identity. The German Historical Museum developed classroom materials that used consumer goods as entry points for discussing deeper historical questions. Students examined coffee packaging from East and West Germany, analyzed how scarcity shaped social relationships, and interviewed family members about their consumption experiences before and after reunification. These approaches recognized consumer culture as a legitimate historical lens rather than a trivial sidebar to political history. Dr. Anna Kaminski emphasized the importance of preserving this everyday history. For too long, we approached GDR history through primarily political frameworks, focusing on the Stasi, the Wall, repression, and resistance. These aspects were certainly central, but they don't capture the texture of ordinary life as people actually experienced it day to day. Understanding how East Germans navigated consumer scarcity helps us comprehend both the system's failures and the human capacity for adaptation under difficult circumstances. This more textured historical understanding extended to how reunification itself was evaluated. Rather than the simple triumphalist narrative of Western abundance conquering Eastern scarcity, scholars increasingly examine the complicated social and psychological processes through which two consumer cultures, one built around abundance and choice, the other around scarcity and persistence, attempted to integrate. The story of East Germans encountering Western consumer abundance became recognized not just as an amusing anecdote about banana excitement, but as a profound case study in how material conditions shape identity, how consumer goods acquire cultural meaning beyond their practical use, and how economic systems become internalized as psychological orientations that persist even after external circumstances change. As Germany marked the 30th anniversary of reunification in 2020, these consumer differences had largely faded into history for younger generations. Bananas were simply fruit, coffee simply a beverage. Yet for those who had experienced the divided years, these ordinary items remained silent witnesses to an extraordinary historical transformation, from a world where a banana could symbolize an entire political economic system to one where such symbolism had become nearly incomprehensible. The ultimate legacy of this consumer division extended beyond specific products to deeper questions about the relationship between material abundance and human satisfaction. The East German experience demonstrated that people could create meaningful lives despite material limitations, developing social adaptations and cultural practices that compensated for consumer scarcity. The West German experience showed that material abundance, while eliminating certain hardships, created its own forms of dissatisfaction through endless choice and constantly escalating expectations. Reunification brought these two systems into direct contact, creating both painful dislocations and opportunities for mutual learning. If East Germans gained access to consumer abundance they had long desired, some West Germans gained appreciation for values beyond consumption, community solidarity, resource conservation, and the satisfaction of making rather than merely buying. The humble banana, once the quintessential symbol of this division, returned to its proper place as simply a fruit, available to all, special to none. Yet the story of how this curved yellow fruit once embodied the hopes, frustrations, and ultimately the reunification of a divided nation remains a powerful reminder of how deeply political systems shape even the most ordinary aspects of daily life. The banana shortages ended, but the lessons about consumption, satisfaction, and human adaptability continue to resonate in a world still wrestling with questions of material desire, economic justice, and environmental sustainability.